welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're continuing with the build of my Tamiya DT-03 Racing Fighter two-wheel drive off-road buggy. This is the 5th video in the build series of my racing fighter, but if you want to check out the previous video, I'll put a link in the card in the top corner and I'll leave a link in the description below. Now for those of you who have been following along with this build, I realize it's been a while, but this racing fighter unfortunately took a back seat a few months ago when I started working on my team associated RC10 B6.3 racing buggy. And if you're interested to check out that build series, I'll leave a link to the playlist in the cards so you can check that out. But now that my B6.3 is done and about ready to hit the track, it's time to get back into this build. So in this video, we'll be focusing on parts bag D, which should take us to the completion of this racing fighter. And as in previous build videos, I'll add time markers in the description so you can reference or rewatch specific parts of this build without having to scrub through the entire video. And of course, if you want to follow along with what's coming up for this racing fighter buggy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notifications of when I upload the next video. Now, before we get into this video, I do want to mention that there has been one small change to this racing fighter from the previous video. And that is that I've swapped out the Savox SC1257 TG servo I originally installed in this buggy for a more appropriate Savox SV022 MG steering servo. I repurposed the SC1257 TG servo for my RC10 B6.3 build because frankly, it's far better suited for competition duty and would be put to far better use in the B6.3 than it would have been in the racing fighter. But that's not to say the replacement servo isn't a good one. Frankly, for the money, the Savox SV022 MG servo is a great budget-friendly unit with more than acceptable performance for a buggy like the racing fighter. In fact, I like this servo so much that I'll be using more of them in a few of my upcoming builds. But otherwise, this buggy is exactly as we left it, and it's calling out to be finished up. So without any further delay, let's get started by getting into parts bag D. Alright, so I've emptied out the contents of parts bag D and I've placed some of the parts in the small labeled bins along the top of my mat here, and I've placed a few of the remaining parts in these bins next to me here, including the ubiquitous Tamiya T-wrench we're all very familiar with. I've also loosely organized some of the items in this bin next to me here to make it easier as I make my way through this build. I should also mention there's additional items which are called up in the instruction manual over here on my left, which we will be getting into in this build video. So now that we're all organized and ready to go, let's get started with the first step of parts bag D. All right, so in order to get into the first step of parts bag D, we got to get this chassis out of the way. All right, so parts bag D actually starts with step number 26, and step 26 actually has us installing the front and rear shocks that we built in a previous video right here onto the front and rear shock tower braces, which are right here. Big plastic pieces. Now I already took these off of the sprue that they came on. So these are the stock tower braces using 4 3x14mm step screws, which are right in here. Right there. Now, in my case, I'm actually not going to be using the stock plastic tower braces. Instead, I have opted for Tamiya's hop-up option front and rear carbon fiber damper stays. This one here is the front and this one here is the rear. Now the front and rear hop-up option carbon stays actually come with their own instructions and their own fasteners. So in this particular case, I'm not actually going to need the 3x14mm step screws that came in the kit. Instead, I'm going to be using the fasteners that already came with the hop-up options. Now in this particular case, this is the rear carbon fiber stay. So we'll get started with this one and then we'll move on to doing the front one. So let's do that right now. All right, so in order to install the rear shocks onto the rear carbon stay, we're going to need, of course, obviously, the rear shocks themselves, which I have right here. the rear carbon stay itself. Now, I do want to mention that according to the instructions here, you're supposed to add CA glue to the edges of the carbon stays. Now, I already went ahead and did that earlier off camera, so I've done that for both the rear and the front carbon stay. So make sure that you do that if you do decide to go with this hop-up option. Now, I do need to mention, however, that I didn't use the Tamiya CA glue. Any CA glue will work. In fact, I believe I just use a relatively inexpensive CA glue, so that's what I did. Make sure that you do that when you build your own. So moving into actually getting the rear carbon stays to accept the rear shocks, first we need two 3x8mm machine screws right here and two 5mm ball connector nuts right here. Let's go ahead and install those right now. Now, according to the instructions, we're to install those in the center holes. So we're given 3 different holes on either end of the carbon stay. And according to the instructions, we're supposed to install them in the center hole. So I'm gonna go ahead and just do that right now. All right, so the ball connectors are now installed on the rear carbon stay. So next, we are to install or snap our rear shocks onto the ball connectors that we just installed. So that should be as easy as just pushing them onto each one of these ball connectors. And there they are. Our 2 shocks are now installed on the ball connectors. Now the next step, which is a little unclear according to the instructions, is to use 2 3x10mm self-tapping screws, which are right over here. 2 of those, so that we can install the carbon stay to the chassis itself. So let's go ahead and do that right now. All right, so now the rear carbon stay is installed on the back of the chassis, right there. So the next part of the instructions call for the installation of 2 5x9mm ball connectors, which are here and here. And one goes into one of the rear suspension arms and the other goes into the other rear suspension arm. So go ahead and do that right now. All right, so the 2 ball connectors are now installed, one on each rear swing arm. Now, the instructions call for these ball connectors to be installed. There's 2 holes here and here. I hope you guys can see that on camera. The instructions call for the ball connectors to be installed on the most outboard hole. So I've done that for that one, and I've gone ahead and done it for that one as well. So now the next step is to simply snap the 2 lower end eyelets of each of the rear shocks onto those 2 connectors. So I'll just go ahead and do that now. All right, so that is now the rear arms completely installed. Now, the next step of the installation for the rear carbon stays is to use 2 3x12mm tapping screws, which are right here, and these are used to hold the rear wing mount in place. Now, the rear wing mount is right here, a black plastic piece that I've already removed from one of the sprues, and that gets installed back here on the rear carbon stay. So let's go ahead and do that right now. All right, so the rear wing mount is now installed onto the rear carbon stay using those two 3 by 12 millimeter tapping screws. All right, so now that we're done with the rear suspension, let's move on to assembling and installing the front carbon stay. All right, so now that I've emptied out the contents of the front carbon fiber stay, we're ready to get started. However, before I do, I did want to make mention that you'll notice there were two different instruction sheets that were included with this particular hop-up option. This is important. In this case, because my particular DT-03 Racing Fighter came with Tamiya's oil-filled CVA shocks, this larger sheet is the sheet that we're going to be using to assemble and install the front stay onto our DT-03. However, if my kit didn't actually include Tamiya's oil-filled CVA shocks, and instead I was using the standard friction shocks, this small sheet would be the one that I would follow. However, because that isn't the case for me, I'm just going to set this one aside so that it isn't in the way. All right, so now we can get started. Much like with the rear stay, I again applied CA glue around the edges of the front stay. Now, as you guys saw in some footage that I put earlier, you'll notice that when I applied the CA glue, I used a cotton swab or a Q-tip. That's just a little pro tip. I actually find that when I do that, I get a nice smooth finish all the way around the edges, and it's a lot easier to control the application of the CA glue. So there's a little pro tip for you. Try that if you decide to go with this upgrade. So the one thing I do want to mention, this is a little bit different than the rear stay in that we prepare the front stay to accept the shocks, we then install the stay onto the chassis, and then we install the shocks afterwards, which is a little bit different than the rear stay. So let's go ahead and do that and prepare this to accept our shocks. So first thing we're going to need, of course, is the stay itself, as well as two 5 millimeter ball nuts, which are right here. And we're also going to need two 3 by 8 millimeter screws, which are these two right here. According to the instructions, we are supposed to install those into the middle hole. You'll notice there's 3 holes on the outboard side on either side here. The instructions call for us to install them in the middle hole right here. So I'll go do that right now. All right, so the ball nuts are now installed on the front stay, and it's ready to be installed onto the chassis. And to do that, we're going to need 4 3 by 10 millimeter self-tapping screws, which are right over here. Right there. And we're also going to need 2 3 by 0.7 millimeter spacers, which are these tiny little guys right here. Now, the stay itself actually gets installed on the chassis right here on these uprights right here. You'll notice there's 2 holes here and here. The spacers will be installed under the screws that go in the 2 lower holes here and here. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. Oh, one more thing to mention, by the way, the ball nuts themselves should be facing the rear of the vehicle. So I'll go ahead and install this now. All right, so the carbon fiber front stay is now installed on the chassis. Good. Next, we're going to install the front shocks themselves, which are, of course, right here. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need 2 brass tubes, which are right over here. These 2 here. Now, these were originally included with the original DT-03 kit. These were not included with the hop-up option itself. 1 per shock. And we're also going to need 2 3 by 22 millimeter screw pins, which are right over here. right there. And again, these were not included with the hop-up option kit. These are included with the DT-03 kit itself. And that should be it. So first things first, I'm going to take the brass tube and I'm going to insert it into the bottom eyelet of one of the front shocks right here. Now be careful because it is a slightly loose sort of fit, so just be careful you don't lose it, but that's the one. I'll go ahead and just do that for the second one as well. There it is. The brass tube is now installed in the second shock. I hope you guys can see that. So to install the shocks, first thing, we snap the top cap eyelet onto the ball nut that we installed on the front stay. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. I'll do the same for the other one. All right, so top of the two front shocks are now on the stay. Now I'll install the two screw pins, one on one side and one on the other in the lower arms. Now, according to the instructions, the screw pins are to be installed in the outboardmost hole. There's two holes on each arm. Let's see if I can show you guys. There's two holes on each of the front arms, one here and one here. According to the instructions, each one of the screw pins is supposed to be put in the outboardmost hole. So one here and one here. So we'll go ahead and do that right now. All right, so that is now the front suspension completely assembled. Carbon fiber stay installed and the two front shocks now installed as well. Good. Now that technically brings us to the end of step 26 as well as the end of step 27. Now obviously, because I installed these hop-up options, this was built in a slightly different order than what the instructions actually tell us to do. However, the basic operations were exactly the same. So if I wasn't using, say, the hop-up option itself, what the instructions would have told us to do would be to install each of the shocks onto the plastic shock towers themselves, and then take each one of those assemblies and install them onto the chassis itself, beginning with the front suspension and then moving on to doing the rear suspension. So it's the same basic steps, but just done in a slightly different order. So we can consider steps 26 and 27 complete. Let's move on to step number 28. All right, now before we get into step 28, I did want to talk about one thing now that we've wrapped up the front and rear suspension build, and that is a hop-up option I've decided not to install on this RC. Now, this is Tamiya hop-up option 54561, the DT-03 stabilizer set for both the front and rear suspension. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, this is a build video, why are you telling us what you're not installing on your RC? And there's a couple of reasons. First, I'm mentioning this because some of the more astute viewers out there would have seen this packaging in the video's intro, so I wanted to avoid any comments like, hey, you never installed the stabilizer bar set you showed during the intro. And the second reason is because stabilizer bars on off-road buggies are only really useful if you're running on high traction surfaces like a high bite carpet track. And frankly, I don't really plan to run this racing fighter on anything other than loose surfaces like dirt, where stabilizer bars tend to be more of a hindrance than a benefit. So for the time being, I've decided to not install this hop-up option and instead use it to tune the car as I get a feel for how it behaves. After a while, I'll determine if installing either a front or rear or both stabilizer bars will prove beneficial, or if the buggy is just fine without them. So for now, I'll just set this aside while we get on to step 28. All right, so step 28 calls for us to install the remaining electronics onto the chassis, more specifically the electronic speed control and the radio receiver. Now, we technically installed the electronic speed control in a previous video, and I'll leave a link to that in the cards up here. And I've had it tucked away in the chassis here ever since, while I got on with the rest of the build. Now, the electronic speed control, or ESC, that I'm using is the kit-supplied TBLE-02S. And according to the instructions, it's supposed to be installed right about here on the chassis. Now, as we can see by the instructions, we're supposed to install the receiver onto the chassis next to the ESC. For the receiver, I've decided to go with a Radiolink R6F unit, since I'll be using my Radiolink RC6GS V2 radio with this buggy. Now, regular viewers of the channel may recall that I had said at one point I was going to be using the R7FG receiver that came with my radio, but I've decided to use that receiver in a different project that I'll be introducing on the channel soon. So I went ahead and got this 6-channel R6F receiver for the Racing Fighter instead. Now, both the ESC and receiver are supposed to be held in place using the kit-supplied double-sided tape, which is really pretty straightforward stuff. You cut this to size, stick one side to the underside of your ESC or receiver, then peel and stick to the chassis. However, when it comes to my Tamiya builds, I typically don't use the double-sided tape that's included. Instead, I use this stuff here. This is called Dual Lock from 3M. You can see in the back here it has a 3M logo. This stuff is similar to Velcro, but it holds a lot stronger. Now, I use this stuff for a few reasons. First, it lets me quickly reposition and adjust my electronics if I need to relocate them to route wires or to clear something like a battery. And because I use the same stuff in most of my other RCs, I can actually quickly swap electronics from one car and move them to another if I need to. And this dual lock stuff holds extremely well. I've been using this stuff for years, and I've never had an ESC or a receiver come loose or fall out due to this stuff failing. And it installs the same way. As you guys can probably see in the package here, some pieces that I've used in other projects, you cut it to size, peel, stick it to the underside of either your receiver or ESC, then peel and stick to the chassis. So now with all that said, let's get on with the first step of step 28 and get the ESC and receiver installed. Okay, so it looks like I now have the ESC and the receiver in position based on the instructions. I've also gone ahead and connected the 3 wires that are supposed to go to the motor, and the reason why I'm using the 3 wires is because I'm using a Tamiya brushless 10.5 turn motor. I've also gone ahead and connected the steering servo to channel 1 and the ESC, or that is to say the throttle, into channel 2. Now, in my case, because I am using a brushless motor, there is one more wire that I need to install, and that is a sensor wire. Now in my case, I'm going with a Calandra Racing Concepts 150mm sensor wire, which based on the research that I've done is the best size suited for the DT-03 Racing Fighter given the position of the ESC in proximity to the motor. So let's go ahead and install this right now. Okay, so now the sensor wire is installed from the ESC to the motor back here. Good. Now, the second part of step 28 sees us using the kit included zip ties right here to help organize and arrange all of the wires that we've just sort of routed through during the ESC and receiver installation. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. Now, before I do want to mention one small thing. So according to the instructions here, we're supposed to use a couple of zip ties to hold the servo wire and locate it along the chassis, which right along here. Now, this may be a little difficult to see on camera, but there's a couple of holes there and there, and we're supposed to route these zip ties through there to hold the servo wire in place. So I'll go ahead right now and organize the wires as per for the second part of step 28. Okay, so I have now organized all the wiring as per the second part of step 28. Now, you guys probably noticed while I was doing that, I did disconnect the motor wires as well as disconnect the servo. That is normal whenever you're sort of arranging your wires, certainly for the first time. It is quite normal to disconnect and reconnect while you sort of reroute things and sort of optimize how you've routed your wires. I may redo some of the wiring at some point, but for now, I'm actually quite happy with the way this is. So I think the wire routing is good. There is one more optional sort of step that's part of step 28, and that is the installation of the receiver case. The receiver case comes from sprue M, and it's right here. Now this goes on top of the receiver itself, and you'll notice it has relief for the wiring so that you can run the wires out from underneath. This is obviously meant to keep your receiver clean and avoid any dust and dirt from getting into it. And this installs relatively easy right here. All right, so that's the receiver case now installed. And now we can consider step 28 complete. Let's move on to step 29. All right, so step 29 has us installing the tires onto the wheels. Now, in order to do that, we got to get the tires Obviously, the narrow tires are for the front, and the wide knobby tires are for the rear. And we're also going to need the wheels, which are right here. Much like the tires, the narrow wheels will be for the front and the wide wheels will be for the rear. Now, let's get these off this sprue so we can get started. Now, to install the tires onto the wheels is fairly straightforward. First, take one of your wheels and you insert it into the tire, perpendicular to the tire, about halfway. Then, we just twist and stretch the tire over the wheel. Right. And that now is one tire installed on one of the front wheels. It's the same process for the rear wheels as well. So I'm going to go ahead and mount all of the tires onto the wheels using the same process. Alright, so now that all the tires are installed on each of the wheels, according to the instructions, we're supposed to apply CA glue to the inside bead of each of our wheels. Now, I'm not going to be doing that in this video. I plan to make a tire gluing video in the future, so I'm going to consider step 29 completed. Let's move on to step 30. Alright, so step 30 has us installing the wheels and tires that we assembled in step 29 onto the buggy itself. Now, step 30 is broken up into two parts, the first part being the installation of the front wheels and tires, and the second part being the installation of the rear wheels and tires. So let's tackle this one at a time, starting with the front. Obviously, the first thing we're going to need are the front wheels and tires, which are right here. We're going to next need two flanged lock nuts, which are right here. And then, according to the instructions, we're going to need four, that is 2 per wheel, 1150 plastic bearings, which are over here. Now, in my case, I'm actually not using the plastic bearings that came with the kit. Instead, I've opted for metal bearings, which are right here. Now, I've gone with the Fast Eddie brand of bearings, so let's get 4 bearings out of this package right now. All right, so there's the 4 bearings, and that's all we need. Now, I do want to mention, according to the instructions here, it shows that we are supposed to use some Tamiya grease, which is right here, which I believe came in parts bag B. Now, this is important if you decide not to use metal bearings like I've gone with and instead are going to be using the kit supplied plastic 1150 bushings. If you're going to use these, you definitely need to use this grease. However, if you're going with metal bearings, this grease really isn't necessary, so we're going to put this aside for the time being. Alright, now to install the front wheels and tires, it's really pretty straightforward. First, take one of your front wheels, then take one of the bearings, whether plastic or metal, doesn't matter, insert it into the wheel itself, then flip the wheel over and insert the second bearing into the rear of the wheel, then slide it onto the front axle and secure it with a flange lock nut. And there, we now have one of the front wheels installed on the vehicle. However, before I move on to install the second front wheel, I do want to make mention about one thing that is specific to the DT-03 chassis, and that is that the front wheels actually have a little bit of play in them, inboard and outboard. And the reason why that happens is because the thread that's on this axle doesn't actually go far enough along the axle itself. So it actually allows, and it's very, very hard to see on camera here, but it actually allows the front wheels to sort of move in and out, which when you start running the car at any sort of higher speeds, what will happen is the wheel itself will actually begin to wobble. Now, there is a fix for this, and I'll show you guys right now. Now, the easiest way to fix what's called the front wheel wobble on the DT-03 is to substitute the one bearing that you use on the inside of the wheel with a flanged bearing, which is the same size as the bearings that were included from Fast Eddie. However, this bearing has a 1mm flange on it. What this will do is it will actually push the front wheel outboard by 1mm, allowing the flange nut to make contact with the wheel and eliminating the wheel slop and ultimately the wobble altogether. So I'll leave a link to where I got these bearings in the description below in case anyone is interested. This is a relatively inexpensive fix, but it will prevent the wheel wobble that many DT-03 owners have reported and actually talked about. In fact, I will leave a link in the description to virtually all of the different items and materials that I used during this assembly. So let's get this front wheel off and see if I can't fix this wheel wobble right now. All right, so now I've reinstalled the front wheel and there is virtually no movement inboard or outboard of this front wheel, which means that flanged bearing has solved the problem. So if you're building your own DT-03, keep that in mind and get yourself a set of those flange bearings for use on the front wheels. Now, let's just go ahead and install the other front wheel. All right, so now both front wheels are installed on the buggy and they have absolutely no slop to them at all. Let's get on to installing the rear wheels. All right, so installing the rear wheels onto the buggy is a little bit more involved than the front wheels, but it really isn't all that bad. First, we're obviously going to need the two rear wheels that we assembled earlier. Second, we're going to need two flange lock nuts, which are right here. We're also going to need two bearings. Now again, the kit calls for the plastic bearings, but as we discussed, I'm using the Fast Eddie metal bearings. And in this case, we only need one per wheel. We're also going to need two pins or shafts, which are right here. And the instructions also call for two plastic hex drives, which are right here on these sprues. Now you'll notice I haven't taken them off the sprue yet, and the reason why is because I'm not actually going to be using the plastic hex drives that are called up in the kit. Instead, I've opted for Tamiya's clamp type aluminum wheel hub, 6mm thick. This is hop-up option 53569. So let's open this up. All right, so now that we've got that pop-up option package opened up, we can see that we're given 4 aluminum hex nuts, 4 grub screws, 4 pins, an Allen key, an extra pin, and an extra screw. Now in my case, we're only going to need 2 hex nuts and their respective pin and screw. So these two, we're just going to move these out of the way for the time being. All right, so now we've got everything we need. Let's go ahead, turn the chassis around so we get better access to the rear axle so we can install the rear wheels. All right, so to begin, we first take one of our metal bearings, insert it onto the rear axle, make sure to push it all the way into the rear hub. Next, we take one of our pins, insert it into the rear axle. Now, it's a good idea to go ahead and pre-thread the grub screw into each of your hex drives. So let's do that right now. All right, so I've gone ahead and pre-installed the 2 grub screws into both of the wheel hex drives. This will just save you some time and effort later on, so go ahead and do that first. Now, we simply go ahead and slide the hex drive onto the axle over the pin, tighten the screw on the hex drive itself. Install rear wheel and hold it in place using the flange lock nut. All right, so that now is the one rear wheel installed on the rear axle. I'll go ahead and repeat the process for the other side. Okay, so that is now both rear wheels installed on the rear axle. And that brings us to the end of step 30. Let's move on to step 31. All right, so step 31 has us installing the battery pack into the chassis along with the battery hold down. Now, if you don't happen to have a battery at this point for your own build, that's okay. You can move on to just installing the battery hold down. However, in my case, I do happen to have a battery. I've decided to go with this Venom Power 3000 milliamp hour 7.2 volt nickel metal hydride battery. This is a 6-cell flat pack that already comes with a Tamiya connector pre-installed. Now, to install the battery, this is fairly simple and straightforward. It just slides into the chassis like this. Now, we're going to exercise RC safety, and I'm not going to connect the battery to the ESC. You don't want to connect the battery to the ESC whenever your vehicle is not in use. So now the next part of step 31 is to install the battery hold down. Now, according to the instructions, the battery hold down is part M6, which is right here on this sprue. Now, this is just a plastic piece that gets fit in from one side of the chassis and you twist it to hold the battery in place. However, I'm not going with this part. Instead, I've opted for Tamiya hop-up option 54564. This is the DT-03 aluminum battery bar. So let's open this up so we can get it installed. That's everything that's come in the hop-up option, so let's go ahead and install it. All right, so now battery pack is installed and battery hold down bar is also installed. Good, so that now brings us to the end of step 31. Let's move on to step 32. All right, now step 32 has us installing the rear wing onto our buggy. Now, in order to do that, we're first going to need two 3x10mm tapping screws, which are in this container here. Right there. And we're also going to need two 3mm washers, which are right here. We're also going to need our wing mount, which we actually installed when we were following the instructions to install the rear carbon stay hop-up option. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to remove that mount, which will make installing the rear wing a little bit easier. So let me go do that right now. All right, so there's the rear wing mount. We're also going to need two 3x15mm tapping screws, which are right here. Those came off when I pulled the wing mount off. We're also going to need part M4, which is what the two screws that hold the rear wing to the wing mount will actually go into. And that part is right here. Now, I do want to mention one thing. Many of the parts that have been coming out of this bin have actually come from hop-up option 54816. This is a DT-03 reinforced M parts sprue. Now, I actually opened this and began using this particular hop-up option very early on in one of the earlier build videos, but I didn't mention it during this build video, but I thought I'd mention it right now. And of course, we're also going to need the rear wing itself, which is right here. Now, yes, the rear wing is already painted and the decals have been applied, but I'll get more into that in a little bit. All right, so to install the rear wing onto the rear wing mount, we need the two 3x10mm screws, the two 3mm washers, each screw goes into the two pre-drilled holes in the rear wing, there and there. The rear wing goes over the wing mount like this, and then part M4 with the bosses facing away from the wing, and we screw them down. All right, so the rear wing is now installed onto its wing mount. And now we just reinstall the wing mount with the wing onto the rear stay. So let's go do that right now. All right, so that now is the rear wing installed on our buggy. That brings us to the end of step 32. Let's move on to step 33. All right, so the final step in the build of the Racing Fighter is step 33, which sees us installing the body onto the buggy chassis itself. Now, before I get into this step, there is one thing I do need to mention. The step that's shown in the included manual here is meant for another DT-03 based buggy called the Neo Fighter, and it's not entirely applicable to our buggy here. In the case of the Racing Fighter body, there is a supplemental instruction sheet included in the kit, which we're supposed to follow when we get to step 33. This instruction sheet not only outlines what colors we're supposed to use to finish the body and the placement of the various decals, but more importantly, it includes specific instructions for how the Racing Fighter body is supposed to be installed on the chassis. Mounting the Racing Fighter's body requires the use of two separate body posts, which are found on two sprues within this bag here. So let's get those out right now. All right, so these here and here are the two posts we're supposed to use for the Racing Fighter body. So let's get these off the sprues. Additionally, we're going to need two 3x10mm tapping screws, which are in this small bin right here. There they are. Now, the two body posts are installed on either side of the chassis, and they're held in place using the two 3x10mm screws. So let's get those installed right now. All right, so the body posts, hope you guys can see that past the tire there. The body posts are now installed on the Racing Fighter itself. So all that's left is to install the Racing Fighter body. Now, in order to do that, we're gonna first need one large body clip, which holds the front of the body shell in place. I have the large body clip in this bin here. There it is. And we're also going to need two small body clips used on either side of the body shell, which I have in this bin right here. There's the two small body clips. And of course, we need the Racing Fighter body shell itself. Now, as some of you may have already guessed by the fact the rear wing I installed in the previous step was already painted, I went ahead and painted the body of my Racing Fighter off camera. I didn't film the painting process of the body for this video. Maybe one day I'll make a video outlining how I tackle painting and finishing RC body shells, but for this build video, I decided not to, in an effort to not make this video any longer than it really needs to be. I will admit, before I started, I had seen some really nice custom paint schemes on other people's racing fighters, so it was tough not to try something a bit different. But I really liked the box art paint scheme when I first bought this kit, so I decided to stick with it. And here is the finished body shell. And while it may look like a complex color scheme, don't let it fool you. It's really the decals that make it look that way. The painting itself isn't complicated at all. I simply followed the supplemental instruction sheet that I mentioned earlier. After trimming and cleaning the underside of the body shell with soap and water, I applied 3 coats of Tamiya's PS62 Pure Orange paint, then backed it with 3 additional coats of Tamiya's PS1 White. The rear wing was coated with 3 coats of Tamiya PS5 Black on its underside. Then, when everything was dry, I simply went ahead and applied all the decals as per the instruction sheet. Now, when applying decals, I tend to use a spray of dish soap and water to give me some time to align the decals, followed by briefly using a blow dryer to help soften the decals and reactivate the adhesive. This is especially helpful for decals that have to go over complex shapes or details. Oh, and the instruction sheet also called for the application of a piece of reinforced tape on the underside of the shell to avoid the wire end of the servo rubbing the paint off. So now we're ready to go ahead and install this body shell. All right, and with that, the build of this racing fighter is officially done. And frankly, I think it came out great, and I for one can't wait to see how it performs. I have a feeling with the 10.5 turn brushless motor I've installed, it's either going to be a real handful or it'll spend most of its time on its roof. Regardless, I'm sure it's going to be fun either way. Well, I hope you found this video and indeed the entire Racing Fighter build series useful, if not mildly entertaining. If you have, and you've made it this far, go ahead and smash the like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications to get updates whenever I upload the next video. Now, before I let you all go, I did want to say one last thing. Regular viewers of the channel may have noticed that we recently crossed the 1,000 subscriber mark. And while I do plan to make a more formal 1,000 subscriber video in the very near future, I just wanted to take a moment to quickly touch on this milestone. When I uploaded my first video, I never thought anyone would care enough to even watch it, let alone follow along on this RC journey of mine. So needless to say, I'm absolutely blown away by the simple fact that 1,000 of you have chosen to do so. So I just wanted to quickly say a heartfelt thank you to all of you who've taken the time to subscribe and watch my videos. I really do appreciate it. And with that said, thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.